Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 19th chapter of the 6th book of von Clausewitz von Kriege, Defense of Streams and Rivers, continued. We have still to add something respecting the influence of streams and rivers on the defense of a country, even when they are not themselves defended. Every important river, with its main valley and its adjacent valleys, forms a very considerable obstacle in a country, and in that way it is therefore advantageous to defense in general. But its peculiar influence admits of being more particularly specified in its principal effects. First, we must distinguish whether it flows parallel to the frontier, that is, the general strategic front, or at an oblique or a right angle to it. In the case of the parallel direction, we must observe the difference between having our own army or that of the enemy behind it, and in both cases again the distance between it and the army. An army on the defensive, having behind it a large river within easy reach, but not less than a day's march, and on that river an adequate number of secure crossings, is unquestionably in a much stronger situation than it would be without the river. For if it loses a little freedom of movement by the requisite care for the security of the crossings, still it gains much more by the security of its strategic rear, that means chiefly of its lines of communication. In all this we allude to a defense in our own country. For in the enemy's country, although his army may be before us, we should still have always more or less to apprehend his appearance behind us on the other side of the river. And then the river, involving as it does narrow defiles in roads, would be more disadvantageous than otherwise in its effect on our situation. The further the river is behind the army, the less useful it will be, and at certain distances its influence disappears altogether. If an advancing army has to leave a river in its rear, the river cannot be otherwise than prejudicial to its movements, for it restricts the communications of the army to a few single passages. When Prince Henry marched against the Russians, talking about Prussia here, the Russians on the right bank of the Oder near Breslau, he had plainly a point d'appui in the Oder following behind him at a day's march. On the other hand, when the Russians under Chernichev passed the Oder subsequently, they were in a very embarrassing situation, just through the risk of losing their line of retreat, which was limited to one bridge. If a river crosses the theater of war, more or less at a right angle with the strategic front, then the advantage is again on the side of the defensive, for in the first place there are generally a number of good positions leaning on the river, and covering in front by the transverse valleys connect with the principal valley, like the Elbe for the Prussians in the 7 Years' War. Secondly, the assailant must leave one side of the river or the other unoccupied, or he must divide his forces, and such division cannot fail to be in favor, again, of the defensive, because he will be in possession of more well-secured passages than the assailant. We need only cast a glance over the whole 7 Years' War to be convinced that the Oder and Elbe were very useful to Frederick the Great in the defense of his theater of war, namely Silesia, Saxony, and the Mark, and consequently a great impediment to the conquest of these provinces by the Austrians and Russians, although there was no real defense of those rivers in the whole 7 Years' War, and their course is mostly, as connected with the enemy, at an oblique or a right angle, rather than parallel with the front. It is only the convenience of a river as a mean of transport when its course is more or less in a perpendicular direction which can in general be advantageous to the assailant. In that respect it may be so for this reason, that as he has the longer line of communication, therefore the greater difficulty in the transport of all he requires, water carriage may relieve him of great deal of trouble and prove very useful. the defender on his side certainly has it in his power to close the navigation within his own frontier by fortresses. Still, even by that means, the advantages which the river affords the assailant will not be lost, so far as regards to its course up to that frontier. But if we reflect upon the fact that many rivers are often not navigable, even where they are of no important breadth and respects other military relations, that others are not navigable at all seasons, that the ascent against the stream is tedious, that the winding of a river often doubles its length, that the chief communication between the countries now are high roads, and that now more than ever the wants of an army are supplied from the country adjacent to the scene of its operations, and not by carriage from distant parts, we can well see that the use of a river does not generally play such prominent part in the subsistence of troops as is usually represented in books, and that its influence on the march of events is therefore very remote and uncertain. So I come back to this series always wholeheartedly every once in a while, because my strategy about the channel somehow changed in the last couple of years, but just in an emergential sense. I had, first of all, to complete the Von Kriege, just like a mandatory task. The channel is not going to essentially divert from Clausewitz, his insight, etc. I hope to be making also military historically themed videos, not just about von Clausewitz, but the effects of his theory, and generally speaking, the various the von Kriege and von Clausewitz works in general as a source of inspiration of actual strategy and operations, tactics, etc. So last time we had seen the 18th chapter of the 6th book, that was in fact about the defense of streams and rivers, and von Clausewitz every once in a while continues, right, on the previous topic, right, adding something else. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. Today I talked a lot before this, and I need a bit of oiling here. In any case, it's all very simple. As you understand here, von Clausewitz looks at the advantages posed by... He's talking about the defense, right? So he enters that side of the story, then talk about the attack, and the sense here is, of course, what is important for the defense, as we've seen, is actually the side with the stronger form of war at that point, but also the negative aim, right? And so I explained this in other parts, of course, when von Clausewitz does it really much better than I can do. I can just comment. That's how we proceed in this videos. So this doesn't mean like we're talking here about defense and how to defend a country. Well, it's a river or a river net, right? You see here the affluents, etc., the valleys. So just this is an absolute advantage. Always remember, and I will come back on this also in other standalone videos, let's say, that on my channel they're never standing alone, but I mean outside of the von Kriege read and critique, obviously in an absolutely positive sense, that of course this is depending on the intrinsic values that exist in war, right? A river here, von Clausewitz says, is always, as a mean of defense, right, an advantage, right? So here what he's saying is that it's not that there are, like, as a rule, you shouldn't cross a river if you want to attack, because immediately that wouldn't make any sense, right? Well, most people don't understand this appallingly just basic logical concept, right? Or people who read Sun Tzu and think that they have acquired this, deeply advanced understanding. They look at von Clausewitz and say, "Oh my God, this is much more complicated. It must be worse, right?" And Sun Tzu must be just Sun Tzu goes as far as saying you should never, as a general, besiege a city. right? Just for telling you the difference. And I made multiple videos on the basis of what the massive difference, the millenary differences in civilizational development that exists between Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz, and why von Clausewitz is a comprehensive explanation of war, whereas Sun Tzu is just essentially a system of maxims. I mean, part that also coincide with von Clausewitz, because in part they are sensible, right? It's not Sun Tzu was an idiot, actually was smart, but we're talking about a time in history in which people didn't write really because they thought that what they wrote was an actual reflection of what happened in warfare to a greater extent. The von Kriege actually is, and it's the first and last work of this kind. That's why we look at it. Now, so defense of streams and rivers continued. We have still to add something respecting the influence of streams and rivers on the defense of a country, even when they are not themselves defended, right? Because of course the river hampers the operations of anyone who tries to cross it, so that is offending, right? One or another. So even if you're not defending that, there is an additional obstacle, of course, that you have to surpass. Every important river, with its main valley and its adjacent valleys, forms a very considerable obstacle in a country, and in that way it is therefore advantageous to defense in general, right? In general. This is the key. Right, for Clausewitz book, but its peculiar influence admits of being more particularly specified in its principal effects. Right. So you need naturally to pass this river, but not only there are valleys that normally just flow into the river with the streams, and of course it's difficult to rise them up, because in general, like, there is the inclination increases. You have still this fortresses that from one side are defended by the other streams, and this is true just for the broader river downstream. So it does complicate terrain to a point that for an attacker the best thing you can do is something goes down, and it's devoid of obstacle, right? Here's the opposite, so that's evidently understandable. So first we must distinguish whether the river flows parallel to the frontier, that is, the general strategic front, or at an oblique or a right angle to it. Right? There are cases like you find today where you have a frontier that is essentially embodied by the river, that in this case is actually, and just to see things in perspective, the defensive frontier, or a broader front that is supposed, at least in the campaign, to be the one of the guy who has offended, right? And that also is not the entirety of the frontier as such, so it plays with that in very different ways, and not always, like at some point on the other side you do have the same defender, right? So just for a trait of the river, this is true, and that of course complicates the whole system. But the importance there is, of course, that as far as in general as that that course of water for that trade is concerned, that represents at this point the efforts of an offending party, or a counter-offending party that is trying to cross to settle some bridgeheads, etc. So this is different when you, in fact, you rise up to the same river, just for talking of the same example, and you realize that at some point you have an oblique or right angle to it, right? So things change in that case. In case of the parallel direction, so when river course and the frontier overlap, we must observe the difference between having our own army or that of the enemy behind it, and in both cases again the distance between it and the army. So the river, all right. So an army on the defensive having behind it a large river within easy reach, let's say not less than a day's march, and on that river an adequate number of secure crossings, is unquestionably in a much stronger situation than it would be without the river. This is happening, by the way, in eastern Ukraine right now. So that you have the Russians, for example, have pushed to try to divert Ukrainian reserves on the eastern front, not on the Zaporizhian one, but you have on the east some Ukrainian positions that are resisting essentially with a river, because that's also complex in the way it develops, like in this in the case of the major Dnieper, at the rear. Right, at that point, von Clausewitz says, of course, it's very important to have a crossing in case of evacuation, in many ways, because, as we observed also in the videos about the previous river defense issues, right? It's much easier at that point to withdraw, because the river itself forms a barrier that the enemy cannot quite exploit, because the enemy cannot quite pass the bridge simply after the defender has retreated behind the river, because notoriously the threat there is for anyone to get into that thin line to emerge from the other side, where even a much smaller force could cut down the offending one, like the invading one, in detail, right? And even in the case, in fact, of a force that has just retreated, that of course is establishing itself in a defensive position behind the river. It's not going to go away from there, because generally speaking, that's how it works as well, right? And von Clausewitz, in fact, says, for if here the defender is the subject, so an army on the defensive, yes, where if it loses a little in freedom of movement by the requisite care for the security of the crossings, right, still gains much more by the security of its strategic rear than that means chiefly of its lines of communication. That's also the point. Through that crossing, you can make supplies keep pouring in. And in that case, it's very difficult for the same enemy to come closer, to disrupt them, because there is a major obstacle in between. Basically, you don't have a target, right? The same bridges are not just so simple to destroy, when especially there is a force that is still between you and the bank, right? So everything is complicated in that case. But it's not the best of positions either for the defender, because, of course, if something can still go wrong in that circumstance, you find yourself with the river on the back. And there are many instances of this historically, not just in this specific situation of a guy that is defending a crossing, but just for anybody who, in fact, doesn't really have a crossing behind. And this happens in many battles, for which we often hear, those guys drowned, they drowned in the river or in the marshes, the swamps behind, just next to the battlefield, because that's where they were pushed and they drowned. So that's a thing, right? That in that case was mostly caused by the fact that obstacle essentially protected the flanks of the army, rather than, but also preventing her to escape, in a sense, because if you box your own troops somewhere, they're more likely at least to know that they have less escape routes, and that's why many people also drowned in the rivers, because it was not recommendable, especially when you had armor on, if you especially think of medieval times, but the same could be said at other times in history. And so you're not supposed to cross the river, especially if the river bed is tricky, there are currents or things like that. I mean, this is literally worst can happen in that circumstance. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, in all this we allude to a defense in our own country. Right, so in the enemy's country, although his army might be before us, we should still have always more or less to apprehend his appearance behind us on the other side of the river, and then the river, involving as it does narrow defiles in roads, would be more disadvantageous than otherwise in its effect on our situation. Now, this is interesting because exactly for the same Ukrainian front, you see how easy it is actually to think of that. If you think about the Inulets or the Siversky Donets in the Ukrainian counteroffensive in last autumn, you've seen, of course, here having the diagonal, you had actually both what von Clausewitz is describing here, both the frontier running through to a front, and then the possibility of an enemy actually emerging from at least your side, the side that you control from the river, in that case for an advance sideways, right? And things can get easily complicated. There have been lots of other examples because there's plenty of other rivers, etc. But just to picture what can happen, von Clausewitz is saying something pretty obvious here, but that is not banal as such. That is, if you are defending a river from within a country that is enemy, right? That is at least occupied, you must be careful because there can be something going on also behind your back, right? So you could be caught at that point between the river and the enemy that wants to cross, and so you have to move, and at that point the enemy can cross. Right, so that is, in many ways, what in general it's been attempted even to make the enemy dislodge at different times. Especially if you can, of course, take him from the flank. It's always the preferable move, ideally in the art of war. And von Clausewitz says, then. The appearance behind us on the side of the river, and then the river, involving as it does narrow defiles in roads, would be more disadvantageous than otherwise in its effect on our situation. So you can remain bottled yourself up in this net. And von Clausewitz says, the further the river is behind the army defending, right, the less useful it will be, and at a certain distance its influence disappears altogether, because even if you're relatively close to it, you can't quite necessarily run close to it. You could even be actually cut out of it if an enemy manages to put himself between you and the river. Clausewitz says, if an advancing army has to leave a river in its rear, the river cannot be otherwise than prejudicial to its movements, for it restricts the communications of an army to a few single passages. And that is also risky, again, because you may have, this is true for all, say, obstacles. This is true even for certain fortifications. Think about, I don't know, the African limes in Roman times. Essentially, the armies that broke through this sort of ditches, palisades were so let's say light, that they couldn't meet with most of the full brunt of Roman forces in open field, and as a consequence had to raid and run back, but at that point they had to run back from the same point they had opened, because otherwise it would lose time, especially when loaded with baggage, etc., to try to break another bridge somewhere else, and at that point you could have actually pushed them to, maybe they would make it anyway, right, breaking through at another point, but it was still thought to be an important deterrent at an operational level, if not just strategically. And von Clausewitz makes, but you understand the point, that this is not just about where you enter, but also where you can come back, and also where does your supply lines pass through. Because at that point you're going to be limited. You can't have just a continuous passage throughout the river unless you create a massive infrastructure, let's say, to serve with bridges, etc., which also was done, right? Normally armies must cross rivers, so that's how eventually it's going to it's gonna go. And I would like to point out that even though we have, of course, aviation, etc., well, these principles are still always valid. Never commit the mistake of thinking that Clausewitz was writing about 19th century warfare, so he would have written this passage differently from, if he had lived at this time than in the 19th century. What he's describing is perfectly true and still valid today, and it's probably not meant to become invalid at any other point, because humans will always have to cross rivers, right? And even a minimal disadvantage brought by them is a disadvantage that you do have to consider in warfare. And of course, the Kriege is not just about crossing rivers, right? The intrinsic strategic roles here are and reciprocal actions, etc. Our interactions are always true. And von Clausewitz makes this example about the Battle of Breslau in 1807, right? So the here is Prince Henry of Prussia, was marching against the Russians on the right bank of the Oder near Breslau. He had plenty of point of view in the Oder flowing behind him at a day's march. Right? On the other hand, when the Russians under Chernichev passed the other subsequent, we're talking about 1813, this was War of Sixth Coalition, they were in a very embarrassing situation, just through the risk of losing their line of retreat, which was limited to one bridge, right? And that is fascinating, right? This is the entire point. The Russians were operating supported by the possibility of simply retreating there, while the Russians passing the river had only one bridge years later, and they risked basically everything, because if they had lost that line, it would have been over, right? So at some point you always must run a certain risk if you want to attain a certain strategic objective. This depends on the sort of magnetic force, after all. It's dangerous to try to use. Only von Clausewitz knows how to use the best metaphors when explaining certain things, but it can render the idea, of course, that you are attracted to an objective purpose in spite of the difficulties that will form, right? Because that's the most obvious thing to do. That's, from a military point of view, that's a surprisingly difficult concept for people to understand sometimes, especially when they don't understand much of war, of course, but in general, they don't see why, for example, people would undergo so many losses for attaining an objective, because they often don't realize the strategic implications of that objective. People think that, for example, warfare is about just, strategically about how much you advance. That's not the point, right? Obviously, there is a specific reference and criticism here, because you often get the impression that you don't understand how the Iron Army is played there, and why somebody should fight if they would be sure to just advance. It doesn't make any sense, right? And then things in fact, happen quite suddenly in the end, right? After a great wearing out, etc. And this is to be appreciated at many levels in different circumstances. Now, von Clausewitz says, if a river crosses the theater of war, more or less at a right angle, right, so a 90-degree cut, right, with a strategic front, right, the advantage, and this is almost like what is the case in, certain scenarios. Okay, not make examples, but then the advantage is again on the side of the defensive. For, in the first place, there are generally a number of good positions leaning on the river. Alright, so as we were saying before, it's not just the barrier of the river, but the actual valleys, right? For Clausewitz goes on, in fact, says, uncovered in front by the transverse valleys connected with the principal valley, like the Elbe for the Prussians in the 7 Years' War, that they had to rise up the Elbe, right? So they would find all important fortifications on the river, on crossroads, right? Plus valleys that were fortified, like with hills going up and down in the, the watershed you had to conquer, right? And so if you advance through that axis, you're going to meet with important, as we were saying in the beginning, there are fortresses that from one side have the river, so you can't quite simply surround, or at least that you should try to do amphibiously or just water way, and plus this other literal lines in depth that are constituted by the rivers that flow into the major river. And in fact, the 7 Years' War example is spot on, and in general you understand well why this favors the defensive. Secondly, the assailant, von Clausewitz says, must leave one side of the river or the other unoccupied, or he must divide his forces. This is crystalline clear. You let either the enemy still being on the other side and trying, for example, to cut your retreat by crossing downstream at some point, this is not talking about the direction of the river. That also is important. We will see it, in fact, in the end of not only, it's relatively unimportant overall, but still you must at this point evaluate the fact that the enemy can simply create some problem by essentially passing you by and trying to cut you off at that point, which for an attacker is still much worse than because you could even take a place along the river, but maybe you have you're cut off from your own country in the process, because the enemy has preferred to do so. So you have to be extremely careful. Of course, at that point you will be able to, for example, again, interdict the passage to the enemy more easily, because that's, as we've seen, is always an advantage. But again, it's still other forces that you have to employ somewhere else to divert from the major one that is the most overwhelming, and that especially advancing in an enemy land, and if you are offending, is in general more difficult, of course, than defend. And speaking this division of forces, von Clausewitz says such division cannot fail to be in favor again of the defensive, because he will be in possession of more well-secured passages than the assailant. Because of course they were so since the beginning, and truly he had provided to supply and to again prevent, to favor the same crossing to some degree. So we need only cast a glance, von Clausewitz says, over the whole 7 Years' War to be convinced that the Oder and Elbe were very useful to Frederick the Great in the defense of his theater of war, namely Silesia, Saxony, and the Mark of Brandenburg, and consequently of a great impediment to the conquest of these provinces by the Austrians and Russians, although because the Austrians essentially went down these rivers towards the Hohenzollern's possessions, and the Russians would cross those rivers from the east, right? So that's also a good example of double problem there, and still how you can skillfully defend from using this both advantages, albeit, and this is interesting too, tell how wars really go. Von Clausewitz says there was no real defense of those rivers in the whole 7 Years' War, meaning they presented, of course, a disadvantage for whoever wanted to cross them, but it wouldn't happen because matters were mostly settled in terms of armies fighting somewhere else as a broader strategic force, and of course a river doesn't stop anyone if they really want to cross, unless there is another force preventing that. So that's the point. Always remember, this is fundamental. Nothing has a strategic value per se, right? There are places that are utterly insignificant, and people can die en masse for it, but it doesn't mean that since that place is for example, not big, that you actually understand what it means to be strategically important. Right? This will be clearer when we will talk about the concept of Schwerpunkt per se, because people tend to confuse this. There can be a place where there's literally nothing, it can make you win the entire war, if taken. Right? These things change, right? It's never the same place, right? People, again, are reasoning deterministic, dumb ways for which, again, these values are fixed because it's too complicated for them to understand. The situations evolve in that they can't keep up with that. But, and still, to conclude, von Clausewitz phrases the course of the Elbe and the Oder is mostly as connected with the enemy at an oblique or right angle rather than parallel with the front. Well, this again, the example of the 7 Years' War, and there you best can check that with a map at hand, also because rivers are not straight lines. It is only, von Clausewitz goes on, the convenience of a river as a means of transportation when its course is more or less in a perpendicular direction, which can, in general, be advantageous to the assailant. In that respect, it may be so for this reason that, as he has the longer line of communication and therefore the greater difficulty in the transport of all he requires, water carriage may relieve him of a great deal of trouble and prove very useful. Right. And this is obvious because, of course, you can, if you have to advance into an enemy to advance, and you have this river that is more or less in a perpendicular direction, you can, of course, we've seen the difficulties present intrinsically, but at least what it does is that it's a sort of waterway over which you can carry a lot of stuff. As we'll see now, we were read before, von Clausewitz, however, tells us that this is very often less likely than not, right? Because not all rivers are navigable, because generally speaking, even the banks may be unsuited for, yes, we can transport stuff, but then how do you land it? And how far can you transport that? So it's not really that obvious, right? Water carriage really does solve lots of problems still today, right? Again, water carriage is the most effective way of doing so in terms of sheer, energy spent. But it also depends on where this water is, and what you have to do about where this stuff gets and how and why. All right. In fact, von Clausewitz says the defender, talking about the defender here, but the defender on his side certainly has in his power to close the navigation within his own frontier by fortresses, because if this, again, river runs perpendicular to the frontier, yes, you can enter the enemy territory, but in that sense you just enter through the axis of the river and the enemy is all around you. So unless, of course, you, as it mostly happened, in fact, march with an army in parallel on the bank of the river, bringing this stuff, things are not going to be that easy after all. And still people from the other side of the river can do stuff to prevent you. Again, to even cut the same passage of this stuff back in your position. So it's, again, this falls in the disadvantages for the attacker that we pointed out before. And von Clausewitz says, still even by that means, the advantages which the river affords the assailant will not be lost so far as regards its course up to that frontier. But if we reflect upon the fact that many rivers are often not navigable, even where they are of no unimportant breadth as respects other military relations, that others are not navigable at all seasons, that the ascent against the stream is tedious, that the winding of a river often doubles its length, that the chief communications between countries now are high roads. That's also true, and that's where von Clausewitz points that out and says today, right? So he sees that this is valid I mean, this statement is valid even for today, even in Italy, right? So, and that now more than ever, the wants of an army are supplied from the country adjacent to the scene of its operations, and not by carriage from distant parts. We can well see that the use of a river does not generally play such a prominent part in the subsistence of troops as is usually represented in books, and that its influence on the march of events is therefore very remote and uncertain. And this is a very interesting statement, by the way, because especially as a medievalist, I want to appreciate the fact that when you look at ancient medieval warfare, etc., you understand that the defense of, say, the exploitation of rivers as waterways, right? We've seen it, for example, in the videos recently about the Saxon-Slavic frontier. Mostly the Teutonians rose up over the Elbe to attack Prague, etc. Well, you realize there how important they were, that generally speaking seem to have eased things more than much, right? There are many instances, even in 19th century warfare and beyond, you can say, well, the course of this river in parallel to the army east logistics, this is absolutely true. But consider also the size of armies, right? We've seen it very often in our videos about Napoleonic warfare, right? The size of armies was immense. So, in spite of the fact that, of course, there was more attrition regarding the difficulty of keeping them together, and so obstacles like river were very, very important on the first circumstances. The general importance of this geographical barriers was shrinking, right? What even, I don't know, a stream could be useful in, say, medieval times, make an army crossing because of the size and because of the general difficulties, say the general output of resources to just carry out campaigns, etc. Realize in the 19th century it's evidently not so much like that. I don't think it was such a distant time from the past. I mean, Napoleonic warfare, yes, definitely had changed everything in many ways, but of course, you want to appreciate this also when in the same Napoleonic times you have smaller forces, and so things become more important relatively to them, right? And so for a smaller, say for an ancient or medieval army, what matters is also having this big river as a major bulwark, etc. Very often, later on, so where you could also exploit operationally, tactically, even, etc. This continues to be the case, but to a much lesser degree compared to at least what matters in the general picture for the strategic balance, etc. And this, I would say, is I think very instructive, because it shows you again that this thing is always true in an absolute term, but it is relative within the same campaign, right? You must basically the entire, I think, great problem why people don't follow tradition anymore is that the very essence of religion is this one, right? It's a moral and scientific objectivity about how you must always reason in a double-thread fashion. You must ascertain how valuable something is, but always in relation to also what exists out there with that absolute level, and how relative that becomes, not because the absolute becomes relative within itself, but it becomes relative in function of other connections, right? And this is the point of war as well, right? You can't have a consideration for which, attacking that position it's terrifying. So many people are going to die. Okay, but there is a function that position has in a bigger picture that you must be able to see. And this aspect, you would be surprised by how much politically lost it is. I mean, it's like, again, I have this mostly this fixation about the myth of the butchers in World War I. People do not understand battles like the one of the Somme or Verdun, not because they are more moral people than generals or soldiers or governments of World War I, but because they are fundamentally incapable of understanding the strategic relevance of even just keeping occupied for a given amount hundreds of thousands of enemies in battles that, by the way, killed the same scale of troops from both sides. Right? You can have many offensives that show, like, of course, an imbalance there, but that's the best example. You can pick a guy with a machine gun nest well placed can kill tens of people, but do you get on the broader strategic picture, losses 1 to 10? No. Guess why? Because that machine gun is relative to a specific context, even though people are impressed by technology, by individual perspective, etc. That's an incredibly narrow perspective that doesn't take in consideration the most important things in war, primarily moral forces. That also cannot be quantified mathematically, so this makes materialists hysterical. That's why they reject any sort of value and religion or whatever, because they literally don't understand what it means. But they flip the thing by saying, because the thing has no sense. Has no sense because you do not understand it. There is a very specific scientific sense that makes it clear. And the fact, by the way, that people often misinterpret it even when they are trying to defend it doesn't mean that, it's actually how they say it. Because actually this is a widespread problem that is pretty transversal to much political belief, right? And it's about people in general, not much whether they are left or right, even though the left, of course, is the most, it's the worst side by definition. And I really mean it. If you understand what sinister means in tradition and what's behind that, and I made a video specifically on the way of the left hand, it is useful somehow, because it's still the picture in the absolute, and you cannot have, again, one without the other in the actual civilizational accomplishment, just like that, right, without them. So you understand how much von Clausewitz is able to tell us, after all, even through these apparently smaller videos, that makes always it really exercises you to enter in this order of thinking. Right, that's the most important thing of all. The von Kriege, it makes you understand the absolute importance and the relative importance. Hume would have just showed you essentially the absolute importance of situations that were abstract, and that do not tell you how to cope eventually with the dynamic emotion. Von Clausewitz presents us with a method that is the same scientific method, the true one, not the one that people say science and then they don't even know what it is. Because there is no... I'm very disappointed sometimes at conservatives that I don't even fit in unless you consider traditionalism to be a part of it, which may be fair. But the sense that science and morals are separated, that's basically the greatest mistake you can make in tradition. There is no such divide, and the entire point of not seeing it is why things never work, even if you have wishful thinking regarding how they should, right, or they shouldn't. So it's very important to exercise yourself with this kind of content, because it's basically the most instructive, just in molding your mind through it. And I always, and as far as the strategic insight that von Clausewitz provides, it's not about just the... Here we're presented with a theory, right? And that's also yet another problem people have with normally, that they think that a theory means something abstract. by the way, that's the level of scientific illiteracy that exists in the world right now. But this theory is matured by a general that fought, basically at the wars of coalition in Napoleonic times, and that really guided armies to the point he experimented each of these problems, and nobody at the time had ever created this comprehensive theory of the art of war, with the purpose of essentially providing with like this is what expects you. This is not a place where you have to find answers, if not for very technical things that in this sense are referred mostly to the 19th century, but that's the point of the theory at the time, that in the most important meaning of the work have nothing to do with any particular time. They have to do with the unchangeable essence of war. War can change, and does change, always change. There's never a war that is like another. When people compare and they say, this war is like this other, you see, it's not that there aren't patterns, but it's the obsession of stressing differences here, I think, to be quite disturbing, right? In any case, given that when I make these videos, I notice that people don't watch it because von Clausewitz seems, oh my god, this is boring, it's just the picture of von Clausewitz, what the hell is talking about, we want, stuff that looks like, I don't know, paradox games, pictures, stuff like that. That's exactly the point, right? And that stuff is not going to help you. This one is the only one that does, right? Everything that I discuss on Schwerpunkt derives from, in part from this, like of course, I talk about lots of things on Schwerpunkt, but military speaking, this is where it mostly comes from, right? At least in the way I form myself about this, about war, right? And strategic culture, military history. You cannot learn anything, right? Literally about warfare without having read, translated, and commented on the von Kriege. This is the single most important work that you must learn in order to have any understanding of any part of military history. Right? If you don't, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. Right? Not just offers a model of dialectic, of logic. It really opens your eyes on what war is and how to fight it. Alright, and it debunks most, let's say, first you must support this heavily with military history, but without theory it's a bit difficult to make sense of things, to get proportion of it, simply because most people that study military history study a very narrow part of it, and even just from a strange kind of mix that whenever they don't even distinguish strategy, tactics, right? So they can't define it. They don't know the difference. So the thing here is, of course, a much greater deal than it is. So probably here, usually I remember back in the day, because the von Kriege is not is almost finished. Like, because we made above 3/4 of the entire work by now, so it's also impressive, and I'm a bit sad because I would like to continue. Also, I can think really of von Clausewitz having not completed the work, but really having given already the necessary to understand it as a whole. And before dying, he said it openly, where he found a note saying, "Look, because he was basically aware that he would have died, and there were a few months before the end of the von Kriege, and the idea here is that he was telling us, look, this is unfinished, but it's correct, right? So you can't treat it as a good work, and all the incoherence that people pretend to point out mostly derive from the fact that they haven't studied this work. They don't know what it is essentially, and especially in the definitions of war that they tend to fixate on, right? They see things that they can't understand because, say they see things they can't understand because they haven't read the entire work and they don't know how it works internally. This is typical. You can immediately understand a person who has no idea what the Von Kriege is about, because they always say even very to the point quotes, etc., but they're not capable of eventually contextualizing that in the work. That is actually quite simple. I mean, it's complex as a work, but it's not that difficult to learn unless you don't study it properly. That's the difficulty, no doubt, but it's not because it's abstruse or incorrect or strange or whatever. It's actually beautiful to read. It's written with an incredible intelligence. And that's the reason I chose this. Not just telling the truth. I talked a lot about why I like von Clausewitz, but in general, this is about much more than just the insight. This is about this is a work on morals, even though he doesn't treat ethics as such. He doesn't talk about God, but this thing is inspired, right? To Kant, to Hegel. There is a lot of incredible knowledge also of just basically everything from natural philosophy to technology to just mere political matters, etc., and just the invaluable military experience drawn from this and systematizing this theory. Reason for which probably won't be uploading the Von Kriege too often. It's relatively easy because at this point my mind is molded on it. It's wired after 3/4 of the Von Kriege. It's a pretty sizable work. I have learned how to understand it, how to comment on it, etc. But I mean, it's a work you had to dedicate yourself to a lot, right? So I often made these videos because they don't require but reading, analyzing while I do it, and the background of von Clausewitz that doesn't even have a copyright on. And so it may seem like something secondary, but it's actually central to the whole channel, right? The channel wasn't actually, I mean, it was born with von Clausewitz on, never changed, just like the name, and I still have yet to explain Schwerpunkt, because still haven't done that, right? So at some point we'll get it. And yet this is the most important part. I began, I think, in 1219, right, the year after I started, and I hadn't gone full, like, once a day, if not in the last months of 2018. So this stuff is quite important, and after, when we'll finish it, hopefully we'll pass to the to other works that von Clausewitz wrote, including war games, including other, also military historical analysis that are quite poignantly analyzed, criticized, studied, because he really believed and thought in the application of this, right? He was, of course, participating. He was an excellent military historian, by the way. He wrote an enormous amount of stuff. He was, by the way, dramatically aware of, say, medieval warfare. And people don't get it often because they must make a point, because they haven't read the work. This is notorious, even just in the way he talked about the so-called savage peoples. But he's actually pretty serious about that, and incredibly to the point. Right? There are many historical examples as you have heard today, etc. So I just make a bit of presentation of his work because I've had lots of new subscribers in the last year, and as a consequence, many of you are not acquainted with this work. And so if you will watch this video the first time. If I make a video like this tomorrow as well, maybe half of the people will watch it. So I go every once in a while, for people who don't know what this is, to say, okay, what it is and why is it important, right? So I will buy a bit more of time because of that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.